salle. I'm going to switch to English as well. Thank you very much for your presence here today. And it is now my pleasure to introduce you to a keynote speaker that is a very special person, Mr. Kei Koizumi. He is a scientist, a social scientist, expert in many policy-related issues, with a very good eye for science and trust in science, and all the issues that Vice President of Science Europe has been mentioning, and also Erza Clark referred from the point of view of member states. He has been a very important person at the, especially was Principal Deputy Director for Science, Society and Policy at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy under the Biden mandate. And he has very kindly agreed to be here with us to present his views on the subject of public trust in science. So, Mr. Kei Koizumi, please come on the stage.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. Thank you for inviting me to be here. I'm happy to be here as an American who still believes in the relationship between Europe and America around the values of democracy and security. And well, today, I also say, as a social scientist, as a once and always science policy practitioner, and as a former science policy official, that I'm happy to learn from one another about this important issue of public trust in science. So today I hope to give an American perspective on recent events affecting public trust in science in the United States. I also want to present a little bit of recent data on public trust in science, and conclude with talking about policy responses that we at the White House attempted to consider to restore public trust in science in the United States. And all of these are based on my recent experiences in the White House, but also with continuing conversations with social science and other scientific research colleagues in the United States. So let me start with recent events to review for us what we've all been through. We have been through a lot in recent years, particularly the COVID-19 pandemic and response. And in the United States, those of us in the science and engineering communities were initially very optimistic because we could see science in action in real time. We were able to model a pandemic, sequence a new virus, and develop vaccines in record time, as well as come up with strategies and practices that demonstrably saved millions of lives. So surely, we thought the message that science saves lives became real to everyone. Initially, we saw that the pandemic strengthened trust in science among part of the US population. But many of us in the US science and policy communities missed another story, that COVID-19 also weakened public trust in science among a significant part of our population. We now know that COVID-19 policy responses, based on scientific evidence, undermined public trust not only in government institutions that promulgated those policies, but also undermine public trust among certain elements of our public in the underlying science. And we also know that it undermined public trust in some of the scientific information surrounding policies. In the United States, we see that in the response to COVID-19 lockdowns and vaccine policies, specifically vaccine mandates. And as a result, in following years, we have seen not only public opposition growing to the COVID vaccine, but for vaccines that we have had for decades, such as against measles. We see an increasing questioning of and rejection of vaccine science, such as the effectiveness of vaccines and the safety of vaccines, areas where we have abundant scientific evidence of effectiveness and safety, and in some cases, that evidence stretches back decades. We see it now in the United States in people raising hypothetical links between vaccines and autism, even when there is very little evidence supporting even a correlation, much less a cause. So perhaps not surprisingly, we have now abundant surveys showing that while US public trust in science and scientists remains high overall, as I will detail a little bit later, there are serious declines among certain segments of the US population, such as those who identify as right-leaning in politics and non-college educated Americans. So there are large divides in public attitudes toward science between, as just one example, college-educated and non-college educated Americans. And while people in the United States still say, I trust science in the abstract, this breaks down in the data when confronted with more specific scientific findings such as, are vaccines generally safe? Or are human actions contributing to global warming? So here, let me stop to clarify for all of us that science and policies can be separate. Science, as we know, does not give you policies. Science gives you knowledge and options. Policies are decisions and actions that are formulated from a number of inputs, including science and technology, but also including politics, values, economics, trade-offs, and policy priorities. So one can accept the findings that vaccines are safe while still opposing vaccine mandates. One can accept the findings that the bulk of climate change is anthropogenic while opposing policies that could reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But one has to be honest when opposing something based on values. It is dishonest to try to distort the science to support a policy choice. It's beyond distressing to me to see, for example, the current US administration misrepresenting the lack of scientific evidence of any link between vaccines and autism by suggesting non-existent evidence for a link, all to justify their policies to make it more difficult for people to get a COVID-19 or other vaccines. So that ought to be out of bounds. That is a deliberate violation of scientific integrity, a deliberate miscommunication by a government of scientific evidence. Not surprisingly, I conclude that such deliberate miscommunication further reduces an already fragile public trust in science. So yes, science and policies are separate, but it is difficult to separate the two realms, in part because a lot of us in this room spend our time linking scientific evidence to policies. That is noble work, but it can have consequences for how the public perceives science, because if the public opposes policies, then they may grow to mistrust the scientific evidence used to justify those policies. As another example, our own Centers for Disease Control and Prevention cast doubt on the claim based on the preponderance of scientific evidence that vaccines do not cause autism. A CDC webpage, which last I checked is still up there, states this is not an evidence-based claim, despite abundant evidence that vaccines do not cause autism. So when the American public can no longer trust a science agency to communicate scientific evidence, then public trust in science is indeed undermined. So there are real reasons in the United States for the public to lose trust in science. But let me turn to another science-based recent phenomenon, and that is AI. So it is too soon to tell from the research what the impacts of AI are on public trust in science. ChatGPT, chatbots, large language models, AI-generated online content, etc., are recent. And we are still trying to catch up to these advances and, of course, their proliferation in our daily lives. But we can imagine from anecdotes and stories that the widespread use of AI could further reduce reliance on and trust of traditional sources of information. So here is an example where we have a technology that could undermine public trust in science because it is undermining public trust in all forms of information and evidence. We have early stories that AI is reducing the ability of students to evaluate sources and critically consider information and its provenance, because many people think that AI is doing that job for them of evaluating evidence. We know that it does not. AI can uncritically ingest information from everywhere with limited attention to what we call information integrity. And AI can be used to deliberately distort information and deliberately undermine people's confidence in information from all established sources, not just scientific sources. So science can help, but in the United States, unfortunately, the current government is walking away from its responsibilities in information integrity, in combating misinformation and combating disinformation. For example, the US federal government has long invested in research into what we call information integrity, which is another name for misinformation and disinformation research. In the Biden administration, we issued a research report and a research strategy for how the US government should keep investing in information integrity research in order to protect the American people and to protect scientific inquiry. That research report and strategy is still online, but it is not being implemented. In the Biden administration, I will say that we looked very carefully and with a little bit of envy at European digital media and AI policies. We tried our best to try to copy the best of those policies into the US context. For the United States, we have, it's still on paper, a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. And it is an important pillar because foundational to our AI policy was that the American public needs to be able to trust information and data collected by AI, and needs to be able to trust the information used by and communicated by AI, including, of course, scientific information. But in this administration, the current administration is actively undermining information integrity research. It is attacking information integrity researchers and adopting a hands-off policy for the use of AI and online platforms. Those of you in Europe know that they've gone from being hands-off to actively trying to attack and undermine European policies that contain the practices of online platforms. So recent events do not inspire a lot of confidence in me, especially in the United States, when the US government is actively working to undermine public trust in science through policy in both the medical realms and the information realms. But let me provide some light in my second section. I pay attention to data about US science and engineering enterprise. For example, as found in the National Science Foundation's Science and Engineering Indicators, and as collected internationally by OECD, UNESCO, and other colleagues. Because they are here, I will leave most of the global data to them. In the United States, abstract questions on science and in scientists result in affirmative expressions of trust greater than 70% for most of these surveys. In the United States, among institutions and professions, public trust in science is usually second only to public trust in our military. It is far higher than trust in the presidency, our Congress, lawyers, doctors, teachers, university faculty, and other professions. As I said before, there has been some erosion in some segments of the US population, but overall trust in science and scientists remains very high. That's a position of strength from which we see some erosion. But the data do point to weaknesses, in part because of how we have tended to talk about trust in and knowledge of science, and mostly because of how the US educational system teaches science. In our classrooms, and perhaps in yours, science is still widely regarded as a set of known facts about the universe, rather than a process and a method. We know that the scientific method is a system for increasing our understanding of natural and social phenomenon, driven by hypothesis, experiment, and data, in which all knowledge is provisional, and our understandings can be overturned by new data and new research results. We call this the scientific method. When we recognize, and my social science research colleagues recognize, that we need to move from science as a set of facts to science as a way of investigating our world and our way of thinking. If our public keeps thinking about science as a set of unchanging facts, then we are vulnerable to the public losing trust in science when they see facts being contested or continually revised, as they saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, when we had scientific debates, competing hypotheses, being tested and discarded and revised in real time. For most of us, that was science working the way it should. But we can understand that for many in the public who think of science as a set of facts, that this is a profoundly unsettling experience from what they thought they knew about science. More optimistically, in the United States and in other nations, there is strong majority support for using scientific evidence in government decision-making, strong support for governments financially supporting scientific research, and for governments and schools investing in science education. The public generally wants scientists and science to be part of the work of government. So that is an optimistic pillar upon which we can build. Now let me turn to the policies. So as I'd like to contribute to today's discussions, 3 sets of policy pillars that we might consider in trying to enhance public trust in science. So one strong pillar is what I call scientific integrity and research integrity. Summarized, it's that the public must be able to trust the government's support of and use of science. And for that, I think policies that enhance scientific integrity, research integrity, and robust conflict of interest policies are worthwhile to consider. Scientific integrity. My definition of scientific integrity for policy purposes is scientific integrity is that government scientists can communicate freely, transparently, and without political interference about their research. And the public can trust that the government will use scientific evidence openly, transparently, and without political interference. Research integrity is that the public can trust that research that is funded by the government is conducted according to generally recognized principles of transparency, openness, reproducibility. And of course, conflict of interest policies say that the public should be able to trust that the government research that is funded and used is done in an atmosphere where potential conflicts of interest are disclosed and are managed. These 3 sets of policies, then, can contribute to improving public trust in science by making sure that the national government is using and supporting science responsibly. The second pillar of policies that I want to suggest is that the public must be part of science. It has long been my personal mission, which echoes what we heard from the UNESCO's mission, is that everyone in the public should be able to participate in and benefit from science and engineering. In order to do that, that means that the public and science are not 2 separate realms. They are indeed together. I tell American scientists, scientists are people too. Scientists are also part of the public. And that means the public is also part of science. That is an ideal that is not often, was infrequently realized in practice. But in terms of what policymakers do, what we have tried to do in the United States is to encourage practices such as participatory technology assessment and citizen deliberations. For example, citizen deliberations on climate intervention technologies, participatory technology assessment on fusion research, involving members of the public and scientific research in dialogue to try to determine future research strategies, but also the deployment of new technologies. Participatory research, or citizen science or community science, that, of course, those are practices to directly involve the general public in the conduct of and design of scientific research experiments. And also another pillar of that is to think about science communication as more science engagement. Especially in the United States, science communication still implies strongly a one-way street of scientists communicating to the public. Science engagement, I posit, is more of a two-way street in which the public and scientists are communicating to one another in an iterative, ongoing process. All of these are difficult, and they are difficult to encourage from a policy-making point of view because, well, this is, enhancing the public's role in science is a job for all of us. It is not a job just for policymakers, not just for researchers. It is indeed a job for all of us wherever we are in our societies. And finally, the third pillar of policy is that governments should continue to play the traditional role of supporting research financially. And a couple of topics that I hope governments continue to support or to start supporting if they have not already is, number one, information integrity research. That is, research about misinformation and disinformation, how to spot them, how to detect them, and how to combat them based on evidence-based strategies. In other words, research that can enable us to identify and promote trustworthy information over non-trustworthy information. Number two, science engagement and science communication research. There are research-based strategies for better communicating and engaging around science. Those should be encouraged and supported by governments. And third, citizen or community science. And that is a research tool or research methodology that can be employed regardless of the topic. But especially, we have found, citizen and community science can be powerful for health and environmental research, in which, of course, people in a community are living members and living storehouses of both data and knowledge and lived experience dealing with health and environmental challenges. So, to wrap up, I would like to, first like to thank Science Europe and l'Agence Nationale de Recherche for inviting me to participate in this fascinating and important conference. We have been through a perilous time for public trust in and confidence in science because of COVID-19. And we have tough times ahead in dealing with AI, and with misinformation and disinformation. Now, we are fortunate that public trust in science and scientists starts out high, but it is declining dramatically in some groups within our societies. Now restoring and sustaining public trust in science is a task for all of us. But fortunately, there are policy actions our governments can take to increase public trust. And those are policies in the areas of integrity, also policies in the area of participatory technology assessment and participatory research. And third, there are policies that we can study and provide evidence-based strategies for how to encourage public trust, information integrity, and public participation in science. So on those pillars, I hope we can find ways to learn from one another in this conference and build, and who knows, with any luck and with a lot of effort and dialogue, we can have a world in which we are better able to sustain and restore public trust in science. Thank you all for being here.
Please.